Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about punishment. Now, last week we talked a little bit about extinction as a way of reducing undesirable or unwanted behaviors. And within extinction, we're simply removing the reinforcer, stop reinforcing that specific behavior. Well, there is another way, another technique that we can use to reduce the, for example, frequency of undesirable behaviors, and that is through punishment. So when we think of punishment, we likely think of specific individuals such as parents or teachers punishing another person intentionally. But punishments can occur, just like reinforcement, relatively automatically, and it can give us a kind of a better idea of exactly how punishment functions. So a great example of punishment occurring kind of naturally in the environment would be if you go in to pet a dog, and as soon as you are about to touch the dog bites at you, tries to bite your hand, you pull away, and you're going to be a lot less likely to try and pet that dog again. So the target behavior of petting the dog is punished by being attacked by the dog, and that's going to reduce the likelihood of that specific target behavior, petting the dog, occurring in the future. Similarly, grabbing a hot skillet without using kind of a heating pad. If anyone's ever used a cast iron skillet, you know that the handle gets just as hot as the kind of flat surface of the pan does. So every time you grab that cast iron skillet without some kind of padding, your hand's going to get burned. That is the punisher, or the punishment that you receive for performing that behavior of grabbing the pan without a pad. And that's going to subsequently reduce the likelihood of grabbing that pan without a pad in the future. So again, natural examples of punishment occurring. So how do we define punishment in terms of ABA? Well, people are going to engage in a target behavior. The consequence that follows that behavior, we've talked about reinforcers in the past. Now we're going to be talking about punishers. It follows the target behavior. And the presence of that consequence, the presence of that punisher, subsequently reduces the likelihood of that behavior occurring again. So if we want to talk about more intentional forms of punishment, a child yells at mom, mom punishes the child by yelling back at them or putting them in timeout, which we'll talk about in a little bit. A child acts up in school, starts making paper airplanes. The child is punished by being forced to come back to school after classes and write lines, just like Bart Simpson would. So again, a consequence follows the target behavior that you are trying to reduce. One important aspect of punishers is that they have to reduce the frequency of behavior, or intensity, or whatever characteristic you're interested in. You can think of giving someone a punishment for a behavior, but it not actually having an effect. Well, that's not necessarily punishment. That wouldn't be a punisher. Just like a reinforcer wouldn't be called a reinforcer if it doesn't increase the frequency of a behavior occurring. And it doesn't necessarily have to immediately reduce that target behavior. It can still be called a punisher if it's reducing that target behavior in the long term. Within ABA, it's important to keep in mind some kind of restrictions on what are and what are not punishers, or what should and should not be considered punishers. Punishers or punishment should not have elements of retribution or retaliation. It should not try to intentionally harm the individual. Sometimes harm needs to be done, but it should be harm for the sake of harming people. It should be, to a certain extent, instrumental forms of harm. And the punishment should not be ethically or morally questionable. When we actually implement a punishment intervention, we need to have the best interest of that target person in mind. And again, we need to remember, just like with reinforcement, we're not punishing the person, we're punishing the behavior. The punishment ideally needs to be connected to the behavior, and it needs to be very evident to the person that, oh, it's the behavior is why I'm receiving that punishment, not just because of who I am. That can lead to some serious issues that we don't want to get into. So what are some different types of punishment? Just like there's positive and negative reinforcement, there's also positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment is when we kind of implement some kind of punisher into the environment contingent upon that target behavior. So a person behaves in a specific undesirable way, a punisher appears in the environment, and then that should subsequently weaken behavior. So we can think of many different examples of punishers, such as electric shock, such as yelling at someone, such as another example would be squirting lemon juice into a child's mouth if they're doing something negative. Again, some kind of aversive stimulus or aversive behavior that they're forced to do follows the target behavior that we're trying to reduce. So that's positive punishment. Negative punishment, similarly to negative reinforcement, is when we remove some kind of stimulus from the environment. But instead of removing an aversive stimulus, we're removing a desirable stimulus. So maybe everyone's having cake, and then a child yells and throws a fit. Well, we're going to remove that cake from the environment. Once the child stops that behavior, then we would reintroduce the cake into the environment. So again, negative punishment is removing a stimulus. That's why it has negative in the term, following a target behavior, and that should subsequently weaken the behavior. It's important to remember that this is different from extinction. With extinction, yes, we're removing the stimulus from the environment, in that case the reinforcer. But with negative punishment, we're removing a stimulus from the environment that's unrelated to how that behavior was reinforced in the first place. So if a child yells, ideally it's to get attention. In negative punishment, we're not removing attention, we're removing something else. Maybe they get some money taken away from them, or the cake example. That something that's being taken away from the environment is unrelated to why that behavior appeared in the first place, how that undesirable behavior is being reinforced in the first place. And some prime examples of negative punishment, which we'll be talking about in the next video, are timeouts, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and response cost. So some other different types of punishment, similar to how we had different types of reinforcement, are differences between unconditioned and conditioned punishers. So just like unconditioned and conditioned reinforcers, unconditioned punishers are stimuli that punish naturally, such as electric shock, such as extreme heat, extreme cold. Whereas conditioned punishers are stimuli that are only punishing or only negative after being paired with a conditioned or unconditioned punisher. So that would be a parent saying no, or a parent or a teacher giving a stern look at a child. Naturally, that shouldn't really be a punisher, but the child knows what that is associated with. They know that once they get that look or they get a yell, they're not going to get food. They're not going to get all these kind of natural reinforcers that they may desire. So when trying to think about positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, again, people get these terms confused and mixed up all the time. The easy way to remember them is that if it has positive in it, some kind of stimulus is being added. Positive reinforcement, we're adding some kind of positive stimulus after a desirable behavior. Positive punishment, we're adding some kind of undesirable stimulus after an undesirable behavior. Negative, we're taking away. Negative reinforcement, we're removing some aversive stimulus. Negative punishment, we're removing some desirable stimulus. So this positive and negative don't necessarily mean that people are performing good or bad behaviors. It refers to adding some kind of stimulus after a behavior or taking it away. And then reinforcement and punishment should be fairly self-explanatory. Reinforcing, we're trying to increase that behavior occurring. Punishment, we're trying to decrease that behavior occurring. And also, similarly to reinforcement, again, there are a lot of parallels between reinforcement and punishment. We use similar terms and characteristics of both. But again, reinforcement, we're increasing behavior. Punishment, we're decreasing behavior. But we, again, have different characteristics or influences on punishment that can make it more or less effective. Punishment that occurs immediately after the target behavior is more effective. Punishment that occurs after every instance of the behavior is more effective. We can have motivating operations applied to punishments as well, making the punisher more or less effective, just like we can make reinforcers more or less effective or potent or influential. We can have individual differences in how potent certain punishers are. So coming into work on a Sunday may not be that big of a punishment for someone who really enjoys their work, but it could be a really bad punisher for someone who hates their job. And similar to reinforcement, the more intense or more frequent the punisher that's being delivered, the more likely it is to actually change and modify behavior. So a really intense punisher, such as listening to undesirable music really loudly, is going to change behavior and lead to decreasing behavior more so than maybe a quiet noise or a quiet song. So that's all I have for right now in terms of kind of a basic overview on punishment. In the next video, we'll get into some of the different types or specific interventions of punishment, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the ethical concerns. So thank you all for your time and attention, and I will see you on the next video. Bye.